Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. We are going through The Design Way by Harold Nelson. And today we're going to be talking about imagination and communication. The format is that everybody gets to talk about what they got from this chapter, after which we do breakout rooms to discuss the ideas further. And then we come back with the best question that we have, and we try to collect all the questions, see the shape of the questions, and try to answer all of them. Today, at the end of the meetup, if you choose, I'm going to give you a preview of the other 3 books that we have been looking at, because we are always trying to connect up the various meetups. So at the very end, if you want, you can stay and look at what we're doing with the other 3 books that we are studying. All right, so let's get started. We're going to start with Maritza. Anybody who wants to share what they got from the chapter, go ahead and type a exclamation mark in chat. Maritza.
Hello. So since I'm going first, I'm going to do a little bit of synopsizing here. So imagination and communication. The first time I read this chapter was when we first got the book. And I found this one to be a little bit of a convoluted mess. And I was like, surely I just have to read more of the book, and it's all going to make clear the second time I read it. Sadly, I did not find that to be the case. It's still a little bit of a convoluted mess. But I think the reason is, so if the rest of you found that to be true, no worries, you're not alone. But it's not because it's really a mess. It's because it's so admirable what is the attempt here. Imagination and communication is something that we as humans use all the time, every day. We just do, without thinking about it. There's no thought given to it. So what this chapter is trying to do, it's trying to very painstakingly take something that you use all the time, put a spotlight on it, and explain that for a good design, one needs to think about these things which we never think about, but we're always doing. We've spoken about intention before, and it comes up in this chapter, but even when it doesn't come up, I find that it's interwoven in every word that we read here today. Because it's not that the authors think that we've never heard of imagination or communication. We're being asked to elevate both concepts here. And that's why it seems so difficult, because the instinct upon just reading it is like, well, I know imagination. I know this. We do this all the time. What are they saying here? They're not telling me anything. But it's the combination. So I actually just was in a discussion on Saturday with the Thinking Society, where we were talking about language and the meaning of words and communication. So in this exercise where we're looking at imagination and communication as essential aspects of good design, what we're being asked here is to remember that there are several components to communication. There is the message sent must be received. If it's not communication. You're just throwing things over the fence. And I think that's what is truly being said here. So the penultimate paragraph here says, good designs must be given form and communicated. That's the most important takeaway here. Good designs must be given form and communicated. I would have put communication first, but the reason that it's not is because what are you communicating? That which you have imagined. It's common sense that if we get excited and we're envisioning something that we consider to be new, you want to share it. That's human nature. We want to share it. Now, if I think of this new thing and it's great, how many times have we been up at 3 o'clock in the morning and we read something in some news article, or you see something on television where you're like, wait, I developed that in my head 10 years ago. How dare they steal my idea? Sure, that was your idea, but because you failed to communicate it with anyone, well, it's no longer your idea, and somebody else is going to get rich off of, some L-shaped pillow. And that's what we're being told here. If you are brilliant inside of a box, the brilliance helps no one, not yourself, not your community. Sharing is a requirement. But even more beautifully, the process of getting it out there, outside, makes it more robust, helps you flesh it out. When it comes back to you, it's stronger. You're going to send it back out. It might come back to you again, and it'll be a little stronger. So the concept of imagination is very piecemealed, very much piecemealed in this book, but it's just done to ask you to think about that which one does not usually think. We make assumptions about language and communication because we know no other way. Our entire lives, those of us here who have the privilege of being in a first world type country, we walk with language. So for us, we don't question what it would be like to have to find another means of communication. What we're being reminded of here is that words alone are not enough. It's the concept of context. If context is missing, learning a language is that much harder. Here, if one doesn't consider the other in addition to the self, that which one has imagined has no wings. You want those things which you are imagining to have wings. And I love that here it is stated explicitly that for a thing to be new, doesn't have to be new across all worlds and all universes. New to you is good enough. But new to you requires just as much robust sharing in order to get communicated as does something that's new to the world. The idea of gravity is one that's not new at all, right? Everybody, we don't even think about gravity. I had somebody say that gravity was it was a fact, and I was like, no, gravity is not a fact. Gravity is a hypothesis that we accept as fact. No, well, honestly, that's not true though. Most people don't even ever think about gravity. You get out of bed, you walk down the steps, it never occurs to you that you would float anywhere. It's not our reality. But just because that's not in the foremost layer of our consciousness does not make it any less true that this is not a proven fact. And the caution there is what I'm hearing here in the very painstaking manner in which we are shown the steps for imagination and the concepts of communication as the authors see it. It's to let us know that we are always undergoing a process of communication. There's always some type of imagination happening in your brain. But we must move forward with intention if the result that we wish to see is a good design. So, there's that very silly, maybe not silly, but simple statement, garbage in, garbage out. That's this chapter in just 4 words. We must consider how it is that we're communicating. And the communication must not rest solely within our minds. It has to be pushed outward, and it must be iterative. It's a spiral. So there are a few graphs in this chapter. I don't find them to be as exciting for this chapter as I have in some others. Interestingly enough, the dialogues, the diagrams here, I find them to be helpful for other chapters within the book. Helpful for this specific chapter, I didn't find that to be as much. I would love to hear somebody explain to me why they are, because I know one of you is going to fix that for me. But the idea here is there's common things and there are uncommon things. We don't think in those terms, but just because we don't think in those terms doesn't mean that they don't exist. And the design communication needs to convey comprehension, meaning, and the promised value for something that doesn't yet exist. That's a really tall order. We can't convey comprehension, meaning, and promise value for small aspects of our lives. That's really what is being spotlighted here. It's the idea that we have to consider that this is a challenge, and this could be a potential breakdown point in the design process. And if we're talking about culture, if one is building a community, right? And we have a vision of what we want it to look like. Well, if I think that the best, I want to take all my favorite people and I want to go out into the woods and I want everybody to have their own little house that's about a couple feet apart because, distance, but then I want a communal kitchen and we're all going to get together and we're all going to cook together. Well, in my vision, we're going to cook my types of food. And actually, in my vision, I'm probably going to do most of the cooking. And you guys are welcome to attend and play sous chef because it's my vision, right? What if there's somebody else who is thinking they're going to be primary chef? If I don't grab a piece of paper and sketch out the image for this, little running off to the woods vision with Maritza's favorite people, and then share it with Maritza's favorite people, I've already failed. Because if I just invite everybody over and, hey guys, pick a house, pick a spot, build. How did I communicate what I wanted? It was not robust enough to say that we're all gonna, make a circle somewhere around us and have a communal space. Additional details are required for successful. So when I hear good design, in my mind, I think successful design. Now, successful can have many different connotations. It doesn't mean successful at the alpha level and you're done, you can rest on your laurels. It means for the component in the design process, which we were looking at, we have achieved an understanding of each other's understanding. And that's really important too. Right now, it's not a huge group here in the room today. We have about 20 people. But the odds of all of us understanding this chapter in the same exact way, slim to none. If that is one's goal, one is setting oneself up for failure. A more accessible goal is to solidify what each other's understanding is, because then you get points where we interweave together. And if there is some interwoven points, it gives you grounds for forward moving together. Because when I hear good design, I hear, well, it's not enough for you to find a way to move forward with intention and with meaning. in this service-oriented concept, you have to find a way to grab the hands of those others who are also involved, and you have to find a way such that you are all moving forward in the similar direction. You don't have to take the same path, but it has to at least be in the same direction. And if you don't attempt to do that by sharing your image, and the image, it's also talked in this chapter, the idea where just stating something is not good enough. You have to attack it from a few different angles. But again, to me, that's kind of common sense, right? It seems a little difficult when you just break it all out, but take a moment and put it all back together. And it's just the concept of you have to attack it from every angle you can, because some people are more this or more that in how they understand things. And the goal of communication is to remember, if you are the self in this chapter, you are the designer, right? The self is the designer. What you're trying to do is to send a message to the other or others in this chapter or this book. Those are the clients. You need to send it and ensure it is received. The receiving part is something I think we all at some point forget, because you send it and you're like, good, done, it's sent, I'm gonna move on. Well, I sent the message that all my favorite people were gonna come to this land and live with me. I thought I was done. But now there's gonna be dissent and breakdown when I try to do something that was not communicated clearly enough. I think it's a concept of losing sight of the other. We fail to achieve true communication when we lose sight of the other. And in this book, it's the clients. How can you have a good design if you forgot that you had to make sure that the client received that image? And that's, I think that's the gist of what this chapter is telling us. Is it's a dance between the self and the other. Always remember that it's more than one component, and that you're using things that you use in every day for everything. You can't, just like we can't have almost any interaction without a judgment, you can't have most interactions without a communication. But the difference is that here, you're being asked to hold yourself to a little bit higher standard. Do it with intention instead of just allowing yourself to flap in the wind. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Marisa. So folks, I mean, these meetups are all about communication at a very deep level and seeing how we can maximize the communication. So after the breakout rooms, I would love to apply all the ideas about communication to the meetups and see what people have to say. So that is one of the questions that I'm going to raise after. It will compete against all the questions you put on the table, but that's one of the questions that I'm going to put on the table. Next up is going to be Mike. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I was interested on page 130 in the third paragraph. I'll read the first two sentences. It's the second sentence I want to talk about. It says, imagination gives form to the creative idea as an image. It is, in effect, a type of skill that can be developed and improved through training. And I found that kind of interesting and a pretty heavy statement that one I agree with, by the way, that creativity and imagination is a skill set. But the word training in my mind, or at least in my world, means you're working on a skill set that has to be reproduced in real time. So in the chess world, that's easy for me to talk about. I'm going to be sitting for 6 hours in this position. So if I'm home training, I have to be sitting in this position. Even if I'm doing a crossword puzzle, I'm technically training for chess. because I'm thinking without moving in a pose that I'm going to be stuck in for a certain amount of time. Training the imagination, we did here already when Maxine joined us for that improv meetup, because we had that word generator running, for example, and we have people coming up and reading a sentence and then a new word is thrown at them. So in real time, you're generating ideas that you didn't expect a second ago. Where I'm perplexed is what would that process look like in the design world? I guess we'd first have to establish what is it that we're designing. I know how we could acquire knowledge. For example, an architect would have the syllabus for whatever school they came out of, but what would their training look like? You know, because it's different than acquiring knowledge, right? I think study is taking in knowledge, training is reproducing that skill set in real time. So when I read that here, because it's kind of abstract, I don't know what it is that we're designing, but if we were, what would that mechanism look like to train as a designer? Getting the knowledge, I understand. Where I'm left with something of a question mark is, how would you train yourself at that point? And that's my contribution. I just wanted to distinguish between study and training.
Wonderful. Mike, please bring that up as a question after the breakout rooms, and we'll have everybody answer that. Thank you, Mike. Next up is going to be Joe.
See, I knew Mike had something great to say, so that's why I wanted him to go before me. This chapter to me was pretty confusing the first time around. I mean, you're reading the difference between imagination, creativity, and then you're trying to fit it into the other frameworks that we talked about, like the ultimate particular, and coming up with solutions. And one thing I really did appreciate what the authors did note is that that an idea a creative idea doesn't necessarily need to be novel, because there's so many times that you'll go on a project that people think that they have to come up with something new and a new approach and a different way of doing something, and in reality you just maybe need to adjust and adopt a tool or anything, a solution that has been used elsewhere, and apply it in a creative manner. And that is something that is a lost art many times, is that people tend to overthink, I think, when they approach this. But I think the most important part, and I agree with Maritza, is this idea of communication and how the idea actually gets communicated. And I appreciated specifically what the authors had to say when it comes to centering and the ability to listen. And the reason I think that this is so important is because it's the difference between a fixed mindset. And I've been on several different projects in my career where in consulting, people come in and they think they know the solution already. And they have this way, we know the metrics that we're going to implement for human capital management. We know what your workforce should look like. We have this, we even have the intellectual capital that we can apply, and we can even come up with an answer that's really in an expedient manner because we've done it before. But what they lose in that process is the centering in diagram 7.3 is the listening aspect of this. And it's the difference. You have this fixed mindset as if I can't learn anything more and I know your problem better than you do. And I think that any kind of that is a non-starter when it comes to the idea of design in and of itself. The ability to build relationships is another critical aspect of this as well. And that's part of the conversation process. And that's talked about as well, carefully building relationships. And that's a skill, because you have to find the points in the organization. If you're doing organizational change, or I'm just using as an example, you really have to know the individuals that are actually going to be the ones that can make the changes that you need, that can implement the changes that you need in order to achieve your goals. So that coupled with listening, and then obviously this is the dialogue is understanding the constraints and the resources and the people that are going to be involved. The other part that I found, I might even say this wrong, graphologue and implementation aspect of things, that links back. I was able to take those two processes and actually able to link them back into the desiderata to the ultimate particular, and how they actually all work in together. So you can start to see where all these things and your judgment comes into play. So I'm not going to go through that whole process, but those two do map into previous models that we've actually discussed here. I think that's where the only thing I would say is that I have a few different questions that I can bring up during the I guess Q&A period. Actually, I have quite a few questions. I can bring them. You want me? I can mention them now. Or I don't
That's fine. We can take the questions at that time. You get to discuss it in breakout rooms with everybody, and then you can put them up. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Evanique, Charli, Mike, David, and Jen. Evanique.
Okay, so I'm glad I did wait, because Maritza gave me some really insight when she was talking. And I was thinking that imagination is kind of like the start of design. Like, somebody desires something that comes out of their mind, so they imagine it. And then you got to figure out how to do it. And I think that's the end product, or the design aspect. The design is the imaginative thought coming to life in an instance. It's like, this is the life that it resulted in. And I think the design is the way of expressing the imagination. So you have this thought, and then you're like, how do you communicate it? Like Maritza was talking about, how do you communicate that thought? And do you know if that thought is being communicated effectively? It's like, what I saw in my mind? And I think that is what a designer does, is it brings out what the person is imagining. And if it's you, I understand why the author says, it's hard to be your own designer, because you're not objective. You need somebody else to come in and be objective and make sure that you're communicating that what you imagine is coming out. So I really do see the way that the imagination and communication really work together, because you can't have one without the other, really, in order to have an effective design. You can imagine something like Maritza was using the example in the forest. You can imagine something, you can imagine how this works, and then you have 5 other people that are also thinking about how it works. And if you guys don't communicate, it doesn't come out right. But if you communicate, you create something even better, because now it's a whole bunch of people's thoughts. So also what popped up into my head was form follows function. Louis Sullivan, man. So when I think about that, it's like, again, it's the form following the function. Is like, what I'm imagining, how is that coming out? Is it really functioning the way it should? Is the form that I'm using functioning the way I think it should? I don't think I communicated that correctly, but the point is, like, is it doing what it's supposed to do? Is it doing what I imagined it to do? And is what I imagined it to do, is that even really correct? Like, is that the intention? Like, I can imagine it one way, and then in reality, it just doesn't work, right? It just doesn't work in reality. So then you have to picture it, and then you have to have somebody else come in and be like, well, no, I get what you're saying, but this is how it's going to have to be. In the form, going to create a new form, that way it can function the way you want it to. I was thinking of other books that we were studying, and this is going to get a little spiritual, but I promise it works. I always think of like how we came to be as human beings. there somehow had to be some type of designer. I don't care who it is. You can think it's source, spirit, whatever. I'm not saying who it is, but somebody had to create the human being, like the idea of the human being. There had to be a designer. I remember attending a convention one time where they were explaining how science and religion actually can work together, because science is the way of explaining how we were created, and so is religion. And like, who says that a higher power did not use a design to create human beings and to create this world and to create a world that functions like a world that functions to support human life and animal life? Some higher power had to create that and had to design that. And so it made me think of that. And it made me think of the other books that you're going to describe later, like Tao Te Ching and the Bible. But it's all a way of explaining how they designed it. But science is also a part of that. And design is a part of that. So that's it for me.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Charli, Mike S., David R., and Cheng. Charli.
Yeah, I just posted a YouTube video. But before I get into that, I wanted to say all the time that I was reading through this chapter, I was thinking about you and your 52 living ideas as an example of what he's talking about. But this discussion was between George Ellis, a very prominent physicist. He co-authored a book, The Large Scale Structure of Space-Time in 1973 with Stephen Hawking. And then another person was Rupert Sheldrake. And I'm really glad that Evanique mentioned the spiritual thing, because what happened was at the very beginning of this talk, Rupert Sheldrake, who was one of the people participating in that discussion, mentioned that this idea of modern physics is how it understands how something comes from nothing is very similar to the debate that goes back to theological debates a long time ago. And so I found that very interesting. But as it got towards the end of the debate, George Ellis was talking about that reality is brought out from this space of possibility. So you have all these various possibilities, and some get selected and some don't. And so that was how I was looking at imagination. That I was looking at imagination as where a person has a contact with this ground state, so to speak, of all possibilities. It's kind of like a chaos. One of the images that is used by people frequently about life is dancing on the edge of chaos. So you have this order, this structuring of a living system, but it's dancing on the edge of chaos because if you aren't able to adapt, you are less likely to be able to survive. And so that's the heart of imagination, is being able to see alternatives that you hadn't seen before. And so the way I saw that this process was that, first of all, each person was within themselves having multiple conversations, so to speak, within themselves. And then they were part of this allopoetic congress, or a congregation or group of people working together, and each of them had their own collection of conversations within their own mind as to what are the possibilities and so on, and then through this filtering process of common ideas and uncommon ideas, what people have shared and unshared, that through this kind of like a hermeneutic cycle, which is very much like your meetup group, that they come to this common core area where they can finally come up with a common shared idea as to how they're going to move forward. And so it's really a kind of like a way of getting all of the conversations within, because each person has their own collection of conversations going on in their own head. And so they're, so it's kind of like a melding of multiple, all kinds of conversations coming together. And it's, that's kind of how I was understanding it. I don't remember hearing that specifically said about each individual having multiple conversations within themselves, but that's so. There's the thing that Mike was talking about the skill set. That is that is one of the things that distinguishes somebody who's really creative to someone who isn't, because that winnowing within yourself of those, first of all, can you open up to all these conversations? Second, how do you decide to which ones you squelch and ignore, and which ones you bring out into prominence? The ability to choose that filtering wisely is, it seems to me, is the essence of really genuine, true creativity. And it's not easy to do. I mean, it's how do you decide what are your inner voices you're going to listen to and which ones you're going to ignore? But anyway, that's kind of
wonderful. Thank you, Charli. So, I mean, this is a very large point in different psychologists. Like Carl Jung is a very big fan of this way of thinking, of looking at different archetypes that influence you and how they talk to each other. You have, I think Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this, because many times it is easier to think of things when it is personified. And this is actually the way in which a lot of, when you look at, for example, ancient Greeks in Iliad, they're talking about these two gods coming and conversing and arguing with each other in your mind in order to, as a mechanism of figuring things out, of this kind of combination of imaginative, imaginary figures or archetypical figures that are pushing in different directions, and they are interacting with one another, having a conversation with one another to come up with a direction. Thank you. Great point. Next up is going to be Mike S., David R., and Jane. Mike, I can give you 5 minutes if you can stay on topic.
I'm always on topic. And this is that kind of broad topic that it's easy to stay on.
Go for it.
I think the chapter is well written. It's perfectly clear to me, and it's very concise. You put in a statement of work and requirements, and at the other end, after a bidders conference and various verifications, out comes a optimized product. You need a meeting of the minds to make this thing work, though. And to paraphrase what Joe Bullock and Charli, and actually the authors of the book said, this is not a one-dimensional process. You're not living in a one-dimensional world or even a 11-dimensional world. Language in the Noam Chomsky sense, in the S.I. Hayakawa sense, is not really a good way to do this kind of communication. You can add pictures and isometric drawings and spreadsheets and finite element modeling analysis and interface control templates and all kinds of user psychology and traffic patterns and whatever. The meeting of the minds to get the limitation, to get these things done is still a little bit elusive. What often ends up, even after going through the OODA loop feedbacks many times, you end up with, now that you've given me exactly what I asked for, let me tell you what I really want. Let me tell you what I really want, because the requirements aren't that firm either. And that also is an n-dimensional manifold. So we still need something like the OODA loop method to arrive, and prototyping to cross that abyss to make the optimized product. And we need to do that in near zero time and within budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Next up is David. David, go ahead.
So what I found interesting reading the chapter and then listening tonight, as I was kind of thinking back at my own experiences, I guess in the early stages, I started out, and it was more conversational, descriptive text, and they were not as necessarily as effective. And as I transitioned into doing things more visually with images, the design process became more effective and it became more interactive. The process actually even sped up. And when I looked at the image, when I first looked at image number 7.1, it didn't resonate with me. But then when I saw 7.2, it kind of made a lot more sense, because in the early stages of the design, the team members all have imaginations. If you have a good team, they all have imaginations. So they're all sitting there and they all have their own spirals and they're all circulating around each other. And so you're in that center section with multiple spirals of imagination. And what you need to do to bring the team together in the design is to get that imagination to focus. And so you spiral in that area while you're focusing the team's imagination together. And when you have good people that work together and can play off of each other, and you have a good leader for the team, that is a very exciting stage of the process. And once that comes together, then the team then forms, and now you really have gelled that center into a spiral that starts moving out. And as I was reading the chapter, and I'm thinking, the visual nature of effectively communicating is what I kind of took away from this. That actually is what I developed as kind of my own technique. Was I became very visually oriented in the design process, whether it was brainstorming. And the most effective way I found to brainstorm with my team was to actually use interactive solid models live and let our guys, you had a guy that was the quote designer that ran the tool, but everybody could interact and we could actually watch our ideas starting to take shape together, and we could play off of each other. But we weren't playing off each other in a conversation. We were playing off each other visually. We could express our image and then see it start to play out and see how that aspect of it interacted with other aspects within the design, and to see how things came together, and then look at it kind of stepping back and looking at the whole. And so later on, that whole concept of using the visual imaging, I found in the design process was extraordinarily powerful. It was much more effective than people writing design documents and requirement statements and all these detailed text documents. If you wanted, they were needed and they were necessary at a point in the process, but they were very limiting and very confining it too early in the process, because they were too detailed oriented and didn't allow that free thinking that you need early in design. And then as I was reading a little bit later, and when we started getting more into the communications, my approach in managing the projects, in interacting with our customer or the client, if you want to use that term, the periodic design reviews I found more effective if I included a lot of images. and incremental images showing the thought process that occurred, say, over 3 months as a design matured, and why decisions were made, and what was thought and then what was discarded. And that over time, I found with the client to become a very effective means of including them in the process. They felt that they were part and a contributor because they could comment, and they felt free to comment. It wasn't, well, here's the design, guys, and we're going to tell you what we're doing. No, it was a case of, here was our thought process, and this is how we're maturing things, and this is the direction the design is moving in. And in many times during those periodic reviews, the client would comment and provide very good additional information that we might not have been aware of. But from their context, it was obviously worthwhile to be included. So this chapter really resonated with me. The whole concept of the imagination and using that to create the imagery in the beginning of the process, and then using visuals effectively through your communications, not only within inside your team, but within inside your larger context of your clients and the overall program. That's what really kind of made a good design process effective and efficient.
David, that was fantastic. That was fantastic. And I want to build on that. I want to make just short comments now, and I want to put that as a major topic, major question, the role of visual in collaboration. Because what happens is that words, when you do writing or when you do speaking, it is all sequential. And when you're trying to put together thoughts of other people, having visual, it's something simple like a mind map of just diagramming what everybody is saying to see the relationship between them. The visual cortex can do parallel processing and is able to relate things very well. So I would love to put that as a question for everybody of seeing the role of visual in communication and in design. Thank you, David. Next up, give me just a second. Is there anybody else before Zheng? No, it's going to be Zheng. Zheng, go ahead. Oh, no, wait a minute. Kavita had something. Kavita, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this chance. I did not go through the book, but just from listening to Maritza,
Kavita, let's do one thing. We are currently in the first round. We are just focusing on people who have read the book and saying what they got from that chapter. So
okay.
Just hold your thoughts, participate in the breakout rooms, and then you can make your comments in the other section, because I want people to be really focused on the chapter at this stage. But we will open it up for everybody immediately, during the breakout rooms and afterwards, okay?
Sure, no problem.
Thanks, Kavita. Next up is going to be Zheng. Zheng, go ahead.
Okay, great. So I will share the screen. Yeah, this chapter. Okay. Yeah, this chapter is a little bit challenging, as people mentioned. It's quite abstract. The second round, I think I finally get to it and understand better, especially the last diagram. I think explains everything. So at the beginning, is talking about design is bring things not exist to the world, and then the mystery of design is where the image come from. The Rita, I still have a hard time to say this, as a direction and guidance to our intention. And then they mentioned about the difference between the design for a particular situation to scientific description and explanation, which highly rely on reason and logic to explain the existing reality. In design, you create something not exist. So you need both rational and imagination. So design requires creativity to bring the things new to the world, to the production of originality and novelty, to preparation and realization. This process required imagination and communication. So what is imagination? Something not exist to make it real. It's required to create the right composition for the specific situation. They mention imagination is required in any design, more or less, is required in all this because they're all particular in each design situation. So when we create the ultimate particular for each design, we need imaginative thinking to envision what is possible. So imagination also mentioned about in the interpretation process is a form of judgment, because in the reality, even we interpret reality, there's so much going on we still have to use our imagination to conceptualize, to get the part, what is important, to give form to the ideas, to make it communicatable and comprehensible. So this just gives some basic concept about, design, imagination, creativity. And then they talk about the designer, the formative faculty, and studied in the history, Kant was mentioned about the formative skill. There's two types of formative skill. One is about existing things. We use description and explanation. It's more objective. Then there's another formative skill is about create something that's not exist. And then they mentioned we have a lot of more emphasis on the existing observation, explanation. Then the second about the not exist things. So that's why a lot of designers don't really have sufficient skills to really do that. So that relies a lot on the visible, communicable, and understandable to make things that not exist, to be able to show those to the people who you trying to communicate with. Traditional discipline is not focused on how to change reality. That's required imagine and creating new addition to reality. So imagination, they mentioned about formative power of imagination is include for the present. We use both in present, past, and future. So in the present, we use direct image formative for the present. When we reproduce the image formation for the past, then we use image anticipate information for the future. That's the design. And in the past and the present, we have to use well-developed imaginative skill to make the right judgment, to decide what information we take from the past and present. Then in the future, we use anticipate image formation to create the future. So that's how imagination. So it's kind of, this is a little bit complicated just to explain the imagination in different, basically imagination we need in every just like Marissa mentioned, even though we may not even aware how we use imagination, we're using it all the time. Even we make presentation with the present, past, or future, we all use it all the time. So imagination and judgment, that's create the direct image information that's create the design. So the design fundamental is interpretation, composition, and judgment. This all required imagination, plus formative skill we mentioned earlier. That's create transformation, idea, vision to something possible to share. Then they compare the imagination with creativity. So they said imagination and creativity are different. Creativity is the sparks. It ignites novel ideas. It's a potential to become a novel idea. So creativity requires experience and intuition, formed forged from each individual's life experience. And the creative idea usually is situational and particular, is not universal. So it's new and novel to each individual's life. It may not be unique to all the thoughts and acts and things. So this is quite interesting because instead in academia, when you have this creative idea, you have to do the research, make sure it's unique, universally, to be able to contribute to the knowledge, which makes sense. You could have a creative idea all by yourself, like I have a lot of theory I create myself. Then I found, in the past, people already have that theory in the philosophy, which is good, which kind of like confirm you're thinking in the right direction, but you don't really contribute to the knowledge of the human. So creative ideas is new and a novel product based on each individual's imagination. So have the potential to be a valuable addition to the world, but may not be necessary. So you can still have creative idea based to your own experience, but may not be the unique to the whole world, basically. So creative idea use imagination and give forms to create images. And this imagination, as Mike mentioned, is a type of skill that can be developed, improved, and training. And Mike mentioned about how design actually train those imagination skill. I have to share, I think that's why in the design, architecture, art even, we always have studio, which is unique compared to other course you're taking, because mostly you just say their lesson. But in the design, they're always studio. You have to do this project for a week. Usually people don't sleep. They usually don't sleep for at least 3-4 days to complete the project. That's kind of a way to use particular situation to train you how to integrate all the skills you have using imagination in the practice. Then talk design communication. So you have a creative ideas, but you have to use your imagination, give it a form, create an image. Then that image you can communicate. That's like the other David mentioned, image is best way to communicate for communication. I have the same experience, I usually, when I start design with my client, we have this very, very quick description of what they want. So then I said, let me have some original conceptual ideas before we further discuss, because we could talk forever, all these abstract ideas and won't go anywhere. So I come up with the site, come up with the initial plan. Then we have a starting point. Then it's much easier for client to visualize what they want. Then we can move from there to make minor changes to make it more fit to what they really want, their desire. So design communication include both visual presentation of the finished design concept, but also include the essentials, but also important throughout the whole design process is creation and communication of ideas. So then they mentioned the image is fundamental of human communication. Freud mentioned about dream image, that's communication between idea and ego. Then Carl Jung mentioned a universal image, it's archetypal image. So image, the reason image is so powerful because they have all this psychological effect on us. Because when you, just like when you read words, you have to, when you look at the image, they actually just like metaphor, when we talk a metaphor story through metaphor, then we can integrate all the experience with the story. Same as the image, I think. They mentioned later how the image can evoke your past experience. So image is very three-dimensional. So it's not just what you see, it's also create your whole experience from the past, all your feeling, all your senses will be integrated into those image, can evoke all those past experience. So design communication include the graphic text and language. And then there's image based. All this come together, become a true creative tools. Just like mentioned the brainstorming, you need to integrate all these tools to be true creative. And all this design image can be very literal presentation or can be very abstract, psychic abstractions. So I think this is quite important because I found I meet with a lot of clients. They don't really understand, when we start the design, we usually start with more abstract images, even. So that's why when we do the model, even the building model, we don't put in material, we don't put in too much details because we just want to focus on big volume, big functions. A lot of my clients easily get into the details, like, oh, what's the door size? What's the room size? They said, let's focus back on the functional relationship. So I found I have to explain many times to my clients, just like when you draw when you're drawing, you draw a person, you don't get into the eyes, make sure the eye look perfect before you make sure the person's basic body structure is right. When you get all those things right, then you gradually get into details. I think that's same as design image. You start with more abstract image, then you gradually, as your design progress through the internal communication, like everybody's idea come together, then the image become more concrete vision to the design. So from the designer to the client, they need to work together. They call it design conspiracy. It's a synergy of the individual gifts of imagination. So the design process is not just designers' own imagination. They also need, because like David R. mentioned, everybody come in the team, come with their own imagination. How then work together, both in the design team itself, also the designer and the clients, how all those imagination work together. The communication is very important. So from designer to client, this through surveys and from client to designer is empathy. So this external sense data to the internal image then become the image of psyche. So all this kind of like how this imagination work together between the team. Then they mentioned the allopoietic design communication. It means create something intention on behalf of the other design. That's different from the autopoiesis, is self-making. So because it's other making, that's why design communication is so important, because you are not designed for yourself. You don't have to explain to yourself, because design on behalf of others. You have communication is very key, the key for the whole design process. So the ideal design process, they said, is different from the Western technology approach because they have human intention and purpose. So they mentioned a lot of technology approach is more about what can be done. And because it can be done, then they create it, and it's judged based on their economy reference, money as a measurement. But for the design, ideal design process, you have the human intention and purpose. We want to create something we desire in the real world, add something better to the real world. They have deeper aspiration and intention. So the communication of which is not yet exist, which is what we design, trying to design, the communicate and consume it image is a very complicated process. It's a very dynamic process. It's a whole team. Each person come in with their own skill, perspective, authority. Then you work together, create this new form that never exists before, which is very different from you communicate of something existing. You only describe or explain. So it's inductive or deductive reasoning. So when the communication, everybody come with their own desire, purpose, and imagination. Through the communication, use the image as diverse and unique image. You combine the individual perspective, build a trust and common intent, common and common understanding, shared belief as a collective actions. That's a successful design communication. It's both interpersonal and interpersonal. You need both visual communication and word. So all this together is a phenomena and numinal sense and non-sense reason, logic, and all the other things. So this basically explains how the communication, how complicated this communication process could be. Actually, as we get later, we can have better understanding of what the meaning. So then they have this diagram of communication. So you have formal dialogue, which use word. You have visual literacy, use image. Then you have graph log. So the word is very important with collaboration. Like when we communicate with each other, usually we use word. That's the important tool to build common understanding of the past, present, and future, and build a common meaning. Then use image. We can share this understanding. Like image is very powerful to share, especially the psychic understanding, like Carl Jung and Freud mentioned. The image, because you just use word, you cannot imagine the depths of extract new ideas. Then all this work together, you create new form. The graph log you use to convey the comprehensive meaning of the promised value. So this is more then they use several diagrams to explain these things, each of them with more details. The first one is about the process. The first is centering, coming together. All the people get together. That's the first step. Then you have a conversation. Then you have a dialogue. Then you have a graph log. That's the design communication process. Then they give more detail how each stage is. Stage one is coming together, is a centering process. All the stakeholders get together. Then stage two, you have a conversation. Stage three is dialogue. Stage four is graph log. Then you go to stage five, which implement, you make and production of solidify all your design ideas. Then you get to the last diagram, it's much more detailed explaining about the whole process. So the stage one is centering. So all the client, team, everybody get together, stakeholders. Then it's required conspiracy. So the client express their desire and the design team has to listen. The important factor is listen. Then you go to the next stage is conversation. Conversation is very important. You have to be very patient. You have to be a good listener and you build very trust relationship. In this stage, you could potentially form a contract, start this whole real design process. Then the stage three is dialogue. Dialogue need to be clear. It's about present situation. So you build common understanding and common meaning. And then you go to the next stage. Stage four is graph log. Graph log is you get insight. So from the common knowledge, you go to a common understanding and common meaning. So use your imagination to imagine, and you use image that evoke your experience, and use imagination to imagine the future, what is possible. And at that stage, there's a judgment. So you could go around the cycle again through this conversation, dialogue, graph log again, become more saturated idea. Or you could, when you make the judgment, it's already ready, already fulfilled all the needs. Then you can go to the next stage, is implement. You create this required creative insight, create this common shared experience. Then you create the final design. So conclusion, the designer require formative idea. They need to create unexpected ideas, also give the idea a form. This requires both creative and imagination, so we can communicate those ideas to other people, to the client and all the team. So imagination needs to create unexpected, and also imagination is required in the interpretation of the past and the present. The present, the client's need and desire. The future, what is possible, what is needed in the future. Imagination is also reflective skills. It's very important for the judgment. Also visualize what's future possibility. That is design, and also the consequence of the design. So basically, this conclusion said creative imagination and communication is very important in the whole design process. So that's the summary of the chapter. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Zheng. Zheng, your presentations are just amazing, amazing, because they summarize the entire chapter. One thing I want to do is, I'm a very big fan of Louis Sullivan, and he's particularly good on imagination, on the topic of imagination. So what I'm going to do is that in kindergarten chats, there is a whole chapter on imagination, and I have abstracted it out. I did this about 10 years ago when I was rewriting the book to make it more accessible. So it's just 3 short paragraphs. So this is my abstraction of Louis Sullivan's thought on imagination in his own words. While we may say that the imagination in some of its aspects seems superhuman, in others, it is most beautifully human. If it implies the power to receive, it also implies the power to give. If it is as simple as a dewdrop, it is also as complex as a dewdrop. However furtive and shy it may be, still it is a domestic of habit. It is steadied and controlled and made amenable by the other faculties. If it is a wanderer, so it ever returns. It knows where its home is. It needs you as much as you need it. It goes where you send it and returns laden with airy nothings. It is your other self, your best friend, when you know it and it knows you. It will go anywhere after anything, but beware lest it beguile you, for it is tricky and mischievous thing when you are not looking. You must train it carefully for its work as you would train a retriever. For whatever else imagination may be, it is a magnificent retriever. They say imagination is a great painter of pictures and a famous maker of images, a most skillful and ingenious craftsman. If this be so, then house and feed him well and lavish gifts on him. They say too that he is a great constructor and reconstructor. That may be so too. But I tell you that he is also a great destroyer. They say children are imaginative. That is truest and the most beautiful of all. Let us remain children as we grow old. For I tell you, if you kill a child in a man, you kill the man in man. No truer saying was ever said than this. The child is father to the man. So recall in your heart your childhood, which is looking at you with wistful eye and not so far away. All right, so we will now go to breakout rooms. Breakout rooms will last for about 25 minutes, after which we will come back with the best question that you have. And we will try to answer all the questions, starting the breakout rooms now. Start the recording so I don't forget it. Go ahead.
Do you go back to India very often to meet family?
Oh, no, I wish I could. It's long ways, other side of the earth. But about in 2019, I had to go there for business I was there for almost 6 months. So I got to spend a lot of time with my parents. And it's, as I think I've told you this, it's really amazing experience when I go back to India or when I look at anything Indian, because it's like a combination of it being new. So I notice things, and it being old. So I actually can figure out what's going on. And that's what is happening with my, meetups on the Bhagavad Gita. and the Savitri stuff that you watched, it is, that deep background is important in order to come up with kind of new observations. At the same time, I'm able to connect it. But I miss the Indian food. I miss the music, So it's and it's a great thing, it's a great thing to have that culture and have this culture. I love Beethoven, I love some, lot of the West. I'm very much Western in my thinking and in my choices and everything. But some of the things in India, like the reverence for learning, all of that is a big part of me. So wonderful. All right, everybody will be here in 1 second. There they are. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. All right. Okay, so now questions. See, so the thing is that just during the initial phase, there's so many great questions that are already there, but I want to hear more questions, and then we will go ahead and try to answer all of them. Everybody gets to answer the questions too. So go ahead and type exclamation mark if you'd like to put a question on the table. Jang, you're first.
Yeah, my question is, I was wondering, is imagination and reality conflict sometimes? It seems people more in reality is less imaginative. Who's more imaginative seems don't rather like reality that much.
Wonderful. Excellent question. Does reality and imagination conflict? Is there a conflict between them? Next up is Charli, followed by Joe. Charli, what's your question?
Okay, in the process of exercising imagination or expressing it, okay, the visual thing is big. Most of the neocortex is visual, but if you think in terms of embodied cognition, and the object of your or the intention of your design is primarily human centric. In other words, it's with terms of relationships and things like that. That there could be other approaches other than visual. And
can you put it as a question?
Okay, can poetry, as much as visual representations, function as well in developing the conversation about the design process?
Wonderful. Can poetry serve as a medium for building conversation, or, okay, very good. Excellent. Next up is going to be Joe, Evanik, and Mike. Joe.
I'm going to go with I have a few, but I'm going to go with a very boring question, and that I actually had raised already.
If it is boring enough, we are never going to get to it, but go ahead, please.
That's fine. I mean, I really want to ask one. I just don't know how to frame one around the distinction between a creative image and a schema. I don't know, but I don't know how to frame that.
Okay.
So
okay, what's the difference between go ahead.
Well, there, yeah, if you can make that a question, then fine. But I was going to just ask, how do you teach creativity?
Okay, very good. That's not a boring question. Yeah, how do you teach creativity? Okay, folks, if you can come up with a boring question, it's not going to get answered, because that will be put last, and we're not going to get to it. Next up, but he came up with the, he presented, he did this thing where it's a bait and switch. He pretended to ask a boring question to set the foil so low that his question would stand out as being amazingly interesting. Next up is going to be Evanik, Mike, and Kevin. Evanik.
So my question is, are thoughts and imagination the same thing?
Okay, very good. Is thought and imagination the same thing? Okay. Next up is Mike.
I changed my question from the original because of our breakout rooms. The question is, what is the role of removing inhibition in the design process?
Wonderful. Role of removing inhibitions. Wonderful. Okay, next up is going to be Kevin.
Oh, my question is, how do we validate our imagination? Sometimes they see this is good, this is not real, not reality. Like, how do you validate your own imagination?
Wonderful. How do you validate? Okay. All right. I love these questions. You know, most of them, let's do one thing. I'm going to jettison the first idea of looking at communication. There are this amazing constellation of questions around imagination. Okay, so I'm going to just organize them. So let's see here. So what is there a conflict between? So I'm going to just rattle them off. Okay, and then we will put them together. So we're going to focus on imagination. Okay, that's what we're going to focus on. So what do we have here? So we have the connection between reality and imagination. We have how do you teach imagination? I'm going to transform that into creativity into imagination here. How do you actually teach? How do you build imagination? What is the relationship between thought and imagination? What is the role of removing inhibitions in being imaginative? And how do you validate imagination? So that's what we'll start off with. So let's look at the structure of it. So I want to see if I can use the okay, we're going to use the visual thing. Okay, now let me just do it here. You know what, at some point I'm going to learn to use the whiteboard in that. So imagination. So folks, you can use pen and paper on your own. Kavita, you had a question, go ahead.
Yes, my question was how to communicate effectively if the receiver has limitations, like it could be visual or auditory or some kind of learning disability. So
very good.
How to convey.
Excellent question. So communication under those situations. And Addie had a question, what happens if someone doesn't have imagination? What types of brain malfunction does a person have if he or she can't imagine? Okay. All right. Okay. So now let's see. So I'm going to keep them aside for now. I'm going to start with the constellation that we have. Okay. So folks, draw this. Okay. We're going to use David's idea. Okay. So put imagination right in the center. Take a page, put imagination in the center. Okay. On one side, you put reality. Close to that, you put some validation. Okay. So we got those two. Next one, we are talking about learning. Okay, so all issues about learning. Okay, somewhere near that we can put inhibition. Okay, what else is left here? Thought. Okay, so we're just going to look at this. So connection between imagination and reality, validation of imagination, learning, inhibition, and thought. Let's look at first about reality, validation, and thought, and then we will look at learning and inhibition together. Okay, so first question, what is the connection between reality and imagination? Try to keep your answers short so we can get through all these things. What is the connection between reality and imagination? When is it that reality and imagination part ways? When is it that they build on one another? So anything connected with that? So Jeng followed by Evanique. Go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom if you'd like to answer the questions. Jeng.
Yeah, I think imagination have to surpass reality, but when there's no overlap, then you can't really be productive. So as designer, there have to be overlap between the reality and the imagination. That's where you can create this design, basically.
Wonderful, excellent. Next up is going to be Evanique, Kavita, Joe, and Charli. Evanique.
I see it as a loop. So the way I think of it is imagination is the beginning of reality. And then you make a plan, which is kind of like a design plan to implement it into reality. And then the outcome of the design plan is the design. That is the reality. And then in the book, it talks about it just goes back to the next level. It's like, okay, then how do you take that design to the next level, which is back to imagination. So it's kind of like OODA loop, just goes around.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Evanique. Next up is Kavita, followed by Joe. Kavita.
I would second Evanique's point. That was going to be my answer too, because imagination in itself originates when there is a content, which is a form of an accumulated knowledge of our previous experiences, which is from our reality. And that would go into a cycle where it brings forth imagination, and more self-aware we are, we could actually formulate or convey it and communicate it in a better way. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Kavita. Next up is going to be Joe, Charli, David, Mike, Ambika, and Kevin. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say anything any different than the past two speakers, both Kavita and Evanique. I mean, when you think about reality, you're trying to reimagine reality. So, you know, you have to have a certain understanding, and the more aware you are, then you can start to imagine it differently. So they're
Wonderful.
kind of one and the same.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Charli, followed by David. Charli.
Yeah, I don't see it as a black and white issue. I see it as shades of gray, and basically the measure of whether something is real or not is whether it grabs other people's imagination. So if you're the only person who thinks this is worthwhile, then you're probably out to lunch. But the more people who kind of get grabbed by your imagination, the more real it is, because you're participating in a shared human experience.
Thank you, Charli. Next up is David, Mike, Ambika, Kevin, and Maritza. Mike. Oh, sorry, David.
So I think imagination is the exploration of potential realities.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Mike, you got 1 minute.
That means you're calling on this mic rather than
Yes.
the other mic when you say that.
Yes.
I've endorsed what other people have said about reality and formalizing it. We don't have reality because it's much too complex, and we abstract and create a model of reality. And how you make that model, and how consistent you make that model with what other people are you communicating, you become effective. And so that abstraction and meta model is what becomes important. Remembering that the map is not the territory, the model is not the actual thing you're building.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up is going to be Ambika, Kevin, and Maritza. Ambika.
So this is actually fascinating because you can walk in both worlds at the same time. You know, you're in what is known as this reality, the four walls, this lamp, this painting, and this table, and your mind is still receiving images and poems and sensations. And when you want to explain something imagined to somebody, you can use all senses. In fact, that's when it becomes more real to somebody. So they feed each other all the time. And while the imagination can bring you to wholeness, you can also imagine horrid things and get sick from it. So how you use that potential, because it is an amazing potential, really depends on your own awareness of who you wish to be and become, and your spirituality at the same time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Ambika. Next up is Kevin, followed by Maritza. Kevin.
Imagination is based on the reality. Reality inspires imagination. Imagination enhances reality. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Maritza.
Oh no, I'm gonna say the exact opposite of what Kevin just said.
That's all right.
I believe that reality is a subset of imagination. You know, I'm gonna quote Albert Einstein to you, Shrikant. So Einstein has said, he says, imagination is everything. It is the preview for life's coming attractions. So and he's also the one who says, logic will get you from A to Z, but the imagination will get you everywhere. So I believe that the realities, they're a subset. They lie within imagination. So the imagination is primary, then comes reality.
Wonderful. All right. So now we're going to go into the same topic from two different angles. One is, what is the connection between imagination and thought? And how do you validate imagination? You can talk about either or both. Okay, so how do you validate imagination? And what is the connection between imagination and thought? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to answer. No answers?
Shrikant, can you repeat it one more time?
Okay,
Jane
sorry.
can go.
Yeah.
Jane can go.
No. I'll repeat it one more time so that it gives time. So one is, how do you validate imagination? How do you know that your imagination is valid? It is something which is connected to reality. So that's one part. The second part is, what is the connection between thinking, between thought and imagination, which you asked, Evany, so you should know that question. Sorry. So those are the two questions. So it's going to be Jing, Ambika, Kevin, Mike A, and Joe. Jing.
Yeah, first, I think imagination doesn't need to be validated. I believe imagination is the human right. You can imagine whatever you want. You don't have to, people may not share your imagination. That's fine. It's a personal vision. And also, I think imagination and thought, thought is more logical, and imagination is more intuitive. I think imagination is not as logical as thought.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jing. Next up is Ambika. Ambika, how do you validate imagination, and what is the connection between imagination and thought?
Imagination needs no validation. It is divinely present at all times. And so I don't need to validate it. I experience it. And it's a friend to me, and I'm a part of it. It's a part of me. I can transmute one tiny thing into something else and have a poem or a story or something. It just grows from there. So it's ever present, like cosmic consciousness in a way. Imagination and thought.
You don't have to answer both of them if you don't.
No, this is fine, because they all feed each other.
Okay, thank you. Folks, you can answer just one of them or both of them, whichever one you prefer. Kevin, Mike, Joe, and Maritza. Kevin.
They are either, we need to comparison maybe inextricable. It's yin and yang. You cannot either or. Here's let's see if I go to one quick, the joke is son or dad, who come first?
Thank you.
You may see, I'm going to answer you. Okay, answer you. You may see father come first. If we love son, how can father come? So the son come first. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Mike.
There we go. Yeah, I don't like using the word validation with imagination, but I think sometimes you have to face it and ask yourself, are you living in that world to avoid responsibility? Because if you are, then you're drifting into dreamer land. I know people that are very, very creative, but they live in that cloud of their imagination and creativity, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but there are times when you need to step out and be responsible. I think sometimes we avoid that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Joe, followed by Maritza. Joe.
So imagination to me doesn't have to be validated externally if it's for you only, if it's an internal, if it's only for you. But as a design process, and if you're designing something for someone else, then it does require, because you're designing for others, then it does require a certain amount of validation. Because what you're creating is this is the idea of collaboration with others, collaboration with the client, the stakeholder, whatever you wanted to call it. So, and your aim is just not for yourself, it's as a service for others. So I think that's the validation. The validation is ultimately the ideal, but it's coming up that satisfies both you and the stakeholders, as I'll say, and not just the client, but the end user and everybody else that it impacts.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Maritza, followed by Charli. Maritza.
I would say if we believe that the imagination creates the reality, then the corollary there is that thoughts become things. And that's how I would see the interplay between those. And if we're talking about a validation, I view it as the concept of subjectivity and objectivity. So an emotion is a subjective thing, right? So one cannot say that an emotion is right or wrong because it lies in the realm of subjectivity. And as such, an imagination cannot be quantified in the same manner. That's how I would view it. What I hear when what Joe is saying is that the step that would be presented for critique or validation is what would come out of, it would be the product that would be derived from the imagination. So if thoughts become things, we're saying imagination becomes reality or product. And then that is what would be seeking validation. And that's how I would view it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Charli, followed by Mike S. Charli.
Yeah, first of all, I distinguish between thoughts between left brain and right brain. Left brain is basically abstract, representational, combinatorial, that sort of thing. And you can use a computer to do that. You can come up with random sequences of stuff and call that creative, but or imaginative, but I don't. The right brain is grounded, and it's grounded in the sense of being human. And so there is Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, the guy who wrote the Flow book, also wrote a book on creativity, and he made the claim that that you're not creative unless you are recognized as having made a valuable creative contribution. But J.S. Bach was not recognized in his time. And so, but he was later, and so, but the idea that an imagination needs to be validated is, I think, is not entirely out the window. It's because there's this big argument about art for art's sake, for instance. Okay, and yeah, okay, but I still think that if you're going to be participating in the imaginative and creative process as a human being, then how do you know? How do you know that you are doing that? And the validation procedure is whether or not what you produce is something that lights the fire of somebody else. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Charli. Next up is Mike. Mike, go ahead.
Okay, in this domain, you have to, it's context driven. Go back to this chapter on measurement, which we kind of surface scanned, but I read it, I considered that the main chapter in the book. What we did is we implicitly consider an objective function. Suppose you're designing a golf swing or your OODA loop 30-second Boyd thing. If he came up with 45 seconds, he started taking partial derivatives of all the variables implicitly in his brain, and he came up with an objective function which he minimized. And the brain is good at that kind of minimization. And so he did this intuitively. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Amazing. You're keeping the time. That's wonderful.
Well,
Thank you.
I got a similar timer.
Okay. So then this is working beautifully.
Clock.
We have come up with a solution which works. I am so delighted.
Well,
Thank you, Mike.
there's more to how you do those partial derivatives. is
No,
explained in
let's
the
keep that
measurement
aside.
chapter.
That's breaking the timer. We worked so hard for the timer, Mike. Okay, next question is going to be about, these are two questions. I was wondering how to take that. Let's first take, how do you learn to be creative? How do you learn to build your imagination? The general question is, how do you learn to be creative? And then we will look at inhibition separately. Okay, so let's first look at how do you learn to be more creative? And I'm really curious what people have to say about that. So it's going to be Evanik followed by Jen. Evanik.
I don't know if I would use the word learn. I think creativity requires an exploration. So I look at Montessori as an example, where kids are play. So I would say you have to learn to play. Creativity, when kids are playing, they imagine certain things, even from like being outside and making a mud pie to, like, I think we were talking about in our group Legos, how children just put Legos together and figure it out. You can't really teach them how to do that. They just do it. They see if it works or if it doesn't. And if it doesn't work, they break it apart and start over again. So I think it's more of play and exploration.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evanik. Let's broaden the question. We can talk about teaching or learning, because many times, you also need to build your own creativity, and that is a big project too. So you can either talk about how do you learn to be more creative, or how do you teach creativity? Jen, Kavita, Kevin, Charli, Maritza, and Joe. Jen.
Yeah, I think I learned somewhere the best way to nurture, I think creativity all in ourselves, inside us. It's just like when our brain is too occupied with other things, we don't have the time to nurture it. I think the best way to cultivate creativity is being bored. So they actually said in the North Europe, where they have IKEA and Lego, the actually most creative country, and people actually have less activities. I think the American culture, people are just busy running around. They never actually be bored, especially kids now was running by the computer. So I stopped my kids playing games. They were really bored. Then they start to draw, started making things. They start being creative. I think best way to be creative, make yourself bored first.
Okay, that's I have not heard this before, but okay, thank you. Thank you. I refuse to be bored, sorry. But anyway, next up is Kavita followed by Kevin. Kavita.
Yeah, this kind of like resonated with everyone's contribution about exploring, learning how to play, getting back to our childhood. I was actually taking a course on how to be creative again, because every one of us we were born with creative skills, which have been forgotten over the years when we started our busy lives. Just like Jen said, we just have to give it a form for all the imaginations that we have and express it in some form which is relatable to you. Either it could be art or music or any kind of a poetry, anything, it could be anything. But it's just that becoming more self-aware of our thoughts and our imaginations, that we can enjoy the process of creating rather than just focusing on the result. So yeah, more of self-reflecting.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Kavita. Next up is Kevin, Charli, and Mike. Kevin.
I would say creativity about the question yourself, others, and no matter how big they are or how small they small. And open your mind, be curious, and use scientific temper. Learn, play, practice. You'll be creative.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Next up, Charli, followed by Mike S. Charli.
Yeah, basically, I'm going to say very similar things to what has already been said, but I see it as you learn by doing, okay? But having a good teacher, okay, is kind of like a Zen master teaching someone, how to become enlightened. That if you're fortunate enough to have someone, because there's a process of discipline, okay? It isn't simply a matter of just free play, okay? That you have to discipline that art of imagination, to channel it into whatever art form that you are choosing, or whatever area of creativity that you want to go into, it's something that you can learn on your own, maybe. But I think that having a great teacher is a great help. Someone who has been there, done that kind of thing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Charlie. Next up is Mike S. Mike, go ahead.
This goes back to Penrose. The NMDA molecule in the synaptic junctions gets set to a specific kind of pattern, and you modify that using the partial derivative techniques with an implicit goal. And when you fail the goal, when Boyd didn't, and the simulator crashed, he rewired his molecules, and it's kind of a factor. What you've learned is neurons that are fired together get wired together, so it becomes practical. And Penrose's book on the Emperor's New Mind goes into a lot of detail on the NMDA ion channel and how the quantum receptors work.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up is going to be Maritza, followed by Joe. Maritza.
Shrika, I would posit that the answer to both questions, for how does one learn to be creative and how does one teach creativity, it's the same. The individual does. If you think that you should go right, go left. And then when you go left as an individual, do so with intent and purpose. And your other individuals in your community will see you, and you keep moving forward. And that becomes a teaching moment to them. And keep doing it. Every time you want to go left, go right. I think that the idea of, with intention, stretching our minds and going outside of what we consider to be our comfortable boundary is how we will find growth in this area, in many areas actually. And I think the best way to teach, I do agree with what Charlie said, in that you teach by doing. That's the best way. I don't wish to discredit, Zen masters or anything, but I don't think one has to be a Zen master to be a teacher. If you're minding your own business, but you are walking that path with meaningfulness, it's going to shine and be attractive. And those in your community are going to see it and take notes. And hopefully they attempt to replicate it in some form on their own, and then it spreads. And that's how we build a community of teachers and learners. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Joe, followed by Ambika. Joe.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to really expand on anything that, there's been a lot said already. And it's something similar to Maritza, is the idea of dealing with the unknown. And when you're dealing with the unknown and you're getting outside what your comfort zone, you start to have to think with analogies. What's going to work in this scenario? And then what happens is you start to make connections that you would otherwise not be able to make. And in that process, what you can find out is you can come up with some generalized principles for how to address a problem. And I think that that's a really important thing in this process, that you actually have a process, more or less, an idea of how to deal with chaos and deal with the unknown. And the more you experience, the better, more creative you're going to get, because the more, the more things that you're going to have to, you're not going to be doing something systematically. You'll be doing it actually, you'll be always doing something new.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Ambika. Ambika, how do you learn to be creative?
So I am naturally creative. If I can't create something, I think something is wrong with me. So I want to talk about, firstly, I think people are naturally innovative and creative. If you leave them alone, if you don't give them all these gadgets, you go to these villages where they can't afford to buy all these expensive toys. Kids are creating things, amazing toys by themselves and playing. And they bring, it's the whole community that gets together. So something goes wrong when they're given too much. They get lost. And I think that's also what's happening in, people are talking about schools.
Yeah.
That happens. So in one instance, what I did, you talk about stories so much, Shrikant. So I would have them read three kinds of stories. I wouldn't grade them until the very end. That's when they had to illustrate their 3 essays. And that was the most fun thing we did, because some said, I can't draw. And this is what I did with one gal. She was stumped. I said, give me your pen. I took her pen. I did one squiggle, just one line. And I said, here. I turned around and she has drawn a masterpiece. And a year later, she comes and says, Professor, I've become unstoppable just from that drawing. So you just have to open a little door and it's in them. It's all in them. It's amazing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our next question is about inhibition. What is the place of, and what is the importance of letting go of inhibitions in order to build creativity? Ambika, very briefly, go ahead.
I think a lot of kids are frightened to create because they've been either criticized or told not to do this and not to do that, or childhood, the parenting things. And that's where they shut down. And you really have to source that for them and say, okay, let's clear this up, because that's not true. Don't believe lies about yourself, And we lie to ourselves about limitations. So we can't believe, we shouldn't believe everything we tell ourselves. I just say, you're infinite.
Thank you. Next up is Kavita, followed by Evanik. Kavita.
My answer is almost similar to Ms. Ambika, but it's just the fear of failure that people stop from doing things, which inhibits their creativity. And, they might feel ridiculed or blurting out something meaningless, which doesn't make any sense to others. So these are all like the self-limiting beliefs and self-doubts that stop someone being creative. Also like family support and the environment, which is not being so conducive for them to develop their creativity. So I think that's where the inhibition starts.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Evanik.
It's my answer, similar to Kavita's, is that not being afraid of failure, but also not being afraid of criticism either, because criticism, well-intentioned, will help you grow and it'll help you further your creativity and get to the point where you're trying to get to. But being able to distinguish between, positive criticism or positive feedback and just people just trying to crush your dreams or trying to inhibit you because they don't see your vision.
Wonderful. Thank you, Evanik. I want to go back to creativity and make a few points. The way I see it is, one part I see is building a base, kind of relentlessly making, having this rich input of being open to the world, taking in more and more different kinds of things on a relentless basis, because more you have, the more you have to work with, more your imagination has to work with. So that's one part. The second part is that of actually making things. If you just did the input, nothing is going to really happen. You need to be making something. So actually taking action, I think that that's critical. The third thing is that of discomfort. I think that, inhibitions, discomfort, whatever you want to call it, that is the thing that stops most people. And it is really like, it's almost, I've never found that, okay, I've always erred in the direction of saying, okay, wait a minute, I should have just gone ahead and done that. Why did I not do that? You never regret actually going across and making a mistake, because you actually learn a lot from it, no matter what happens. So in general, so that's kind of, acting against discomfort is crucial. The other part is about weaknesses, kind of deliberately working, at least like I would put it for me, it's like 80-20, just working somewhat, at least 10%, 20% on the weaknesses where you are weak. That I think opens up things which otherwise are stopping you, and you don't even know that they are stopping you. The next one is that I see is on feedback. Different people are different. So being very open about expressing whatever you have, and then closely listening to what people are saying. And people actually tell you stuff, but generally you hear only what you want to hear. So actually trying to hear people, I think, is a crucial part. And I have found that one reason I do the meetups is that I learn so much from all of you folks, because it's just, not that you're particularly smart, okay, or not that I'm particularly dumb, okay, but just because it may be true, okay, but not because of that, just because you're different. And just because you have a different set of skills, different background, you come at it from different perspectives. So you notice something that you have not noticed before, or you see something from a different angle. So I think that openness to other people, I think, so that is kind of bringing back the idea of communication and creativity. So I want to now bring back, I don't want to shortchange communication. Okay, this is about imagination and communication, and we have given all the time to imagination. So now, but people do want to talk about imagination. So how does communication, let's take this example of our meetups. What can we learn about communication? What have you learned about communication? And what communication can do for you? How it can build whatever, increase what you can do. What role has communication in the 52 living ideas played in your life? I would really love to know. So let's start with Kavita, followed by Joe and Maritza. Kavita.
I think this meetup was actually meant for me and all my, shortcomings, because I was not a person who would talk or express my ideas just like anybody else would in this meetup, basically. I started just as a listener. I've never read any books before. I have come to know so many good authors on self-improvement, mind hacking, mindfulness. There is so much that I have learned from this meetups, and I have not expressed it, but it gave me an idea how to actually project my thoughts by journaling, because these are the techniques that I picked up from these meetups. And this is because people have shared and communicated what they have experienced after learning these great books, and interacting with these authors and their perspectives, different point of views, which has actually I have gained a lot of knowledge. Like, it's like I read a book even without opening its page. So it's like that for me. And I'm talking like this because I can keep on talking about this because it has helped me to communicate better now. I journal every day. I put and organize my thoughts in a better way. And people have seen my change, the way I approach, the attitude, the confidence that I've gained during these days. So yeah, I'm a living example of what communication can do.
Wonderful, wonderful, Kavita. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Next up, and it's wonderful to have you here. Next up is Joe, Maritza, Evanik, Mike, and Ambika. Joe.
I mean, so I think actually this evening is one of the best examples of this. We each read the chapter, and I had actually spoken, as I'd mentioned previously, I'd spoken to Becky a little bit about what her thoughts were on the chapter and things like that, and just collaborating. And as I was speaking then things started to make sense. And then when you come here and you speak again, you say it again, things start to make sense even more. And then you hear, I really thought, Jang was spectacular, and David in particular. What they said was just, really, really made it crystal clear to me on so many levels, especially the diagrams on communication, specifically how each spiral works individually. And then Mike's point on training and versus development. All these things would not have happened in a vacuum. And that's what 52 Living Ideas allows you to do. It brings everybody together. Everybody brings what they have to say, and each person said something a little different. And now we have different perspectives. And so what little I would have extracted, I mean, I have a goal of getting one thing out of each chapter. That's just, I'm not trying to understand the entire book cover to cover. If I get one thing out of each chapter, but when I come here and hear other people, then I get 10 things out of each chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and so I think that this is the real value here. And not only that, again, it's an act of courage to put yourself out there, to actually put the words that you're thinking to someone else when you're trying to interpret any of the topics that we're talking about, some of the more philosophical ones, or even some of the more ones that are related to design or the Bible, whatever it may be. So I think that that's where it really is something where it's a feedback loop, and it is a community of learners, and this is a way of learning, a very effective way of learning as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Thanks. Next up is Maritza, Evanik, Mike, and Ambika. Maritza.
For me, Shrikant, I have learned with this group here that the most important thing about communication is actually the listening. And also, we sit here, we have our little exclamation marks, and sometimes you're very long before your turn. And it's the fascinating thing that happens is that as we listen to others' responses, our own response gets sharpened, and it sets us up for more precision when we do speak. Like, it helps to solidify what we meant to say or what we were about to say. And I think that is just invaluable to take with us, even when we're no longer in this room here. And it also, for me specifically, it's it feeds into the courage of voicing one's convictions. For me specifically, voicing my convictions. I have often walked with, these like concepts that I thought were these big random thoughts, and I wasn't confident enough to voice them, or if I voiced them, maybe I just whispered them and hoped nobody noticed it came from me. But coming here and walking with all of you, I find that it's easier. It becomes more natural to speak with conviction about something that is a belief and preface it as such. And that the important part is to remain open to the possibility for disagreement and for having my thought or idea changed by somebody else's thought or idea. And that to me is like, it's a fascinating aspect of communication that is like not often considered when we're thinking about communication. Is like in the listening, what you thought you wanted to convey may become something different, more robust and more complete even, which is pretty fascinating.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maritza. Thank you. Next up is going to be Evanik, Mike, Ambika, and Jeff. Evanik.
Yeah, I mean, what I've gotten out of this past year with 52 Living Ideas is the ability to be vulnerable. I think other people spoke on it, but vulnerable for me personally is one of those things it's hard to be. So I'm the type of person that I like to have everything thought out, outlined, whatever. And what I find in 52 Living Ideas is that I can put an idea out there that's not like perfect, and then get thoughts around it and have other people build on it, or have other people, disagree with it. And disagreeing in a respectful way makes you grow, I think. You said something about being uncomfortable, and yes, it is uncomfortable. That's part of the vulnerability. But what you have created, and what all of us have created, I think, in this group, is that people can be comfortable being uncomfortable and be comfortable with being vulnerable, because we're all doing the same thing. We're all running our thoughts, and we are all expressing when our thoughts change based on what other people say, other people's viewpoints. And I think it's no mistake that it's just from people around the world and different thoughts in the breakout rooms. And like I said, tonight was a difficult chapter. I was like so looking forward to reading it, and then I was like, I don't get it. And then people spoke and people got their thoughts, and I was like, oh, I get this now. This is clicking for me now. So I think this chapter in particular goes across meetups. Like, I've learned to read the Bible in a whole new way. I've learned Tao Te Ching, which I never studied before. The Gita, that, that is the one I know the absolute least about. But having people that have knowledge of it, and just being able to even be able to say, you know what, I don't even have anything to contribute, but I can sit back and get contributions from other people. That environment has created like this, it's what keeps you coming back every day. At the end of the day, it's like one of those things, you come back end of the day and you have all these, you come in from work and you could just sit down and talk to people about different ideas and different things and be vulnerable, and just know that you have people here that are going to support you, and they're not going to tear you down because you can't form your idea clearly, or you can just express yourself and feel comfortable and feel supported. So
Wonderful. Thank you, Evanik. Thank you. Next up is Mike, Ambika, and Jeff. Mike.
Yeah, I was going to talk about listening too, how it's really helped me work on, but Maritza covered everything that I would have said. The other takeaway from 52 Living Ideas is I'm starting to really guard my time more now. So we're going to be together tonight. I guess we're going to push 3 hours at some point. And if I were not doing this, it's the end of the day. I could be sitting in front of the TV sometimes just watching the same movie. I could do movie quotes, with my eyes closed. And I say to myself, do I really want to watch this movie for the 30th time? I grew up in the TV age, but since meeting all of you and spending this much time together, I'm starting to guard my time, my spare time, a little more carefully. And it's been quite beneficial, to say the least.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Ambika, followed by Jeff. Ambika.
I think it's all been covered very beautifully, and I think this is a lovely space. And believe it or not, there are moments when I still get shy to speak out, but I do it when I can. It's wonderful. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to point out Kavita Rajkumari. Her name is Poem Princess.
Thank
Kavita
you.
means poem, poet, and Rajkumari means princess. You know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next up is going to be Jeff.
So, Shrikanta, I think that one of the things that sort of gets understood because it's so embedded in the culture of 52 Living Ideas is that everyone is invited to authentically share their perspective. And even, you know, as you sometimes say, to disagree, but what's not going on is when each of us shares our perspective, is that we have to sort of defend it in any kind of an argument with anyone. You know, it's not undergoing criticism by somebody else. You just get to share it and it's yours. And it's your perspective on something that either we read or what it made us think or questions that are posed that we resonate with. And you can do it authentically, really without concern that someone is going to sort of come in and actively contradict it in a way that it becomes an argument. And I think that is a bit of the psychological safety that's embedded in the culture you've created that allows people to really share these different perspectives and be excited about doing it. And it would be very different if it was arguing or presenting, critiquing, and defending. That's a really different culture. And so I appreciate that. And I also really notice it in terms of folks feeling excited about stepping up. So I think that's a big part of the communication and, you know, inside the culture of this meetup.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. So from my side, I want to give you an example of the kinds of things that I am learning through communication here. We're doing these 3 books, Tao Te Ching, Bible, and Gita. Now, the thing is, I'm not religious, and I have had no religious background. I did grow up in the Indian culture, but ever since I was maybe 13, 14, I've not been religious, and I've not been focused on any religion all this time. So this is all completely new to me. It started with Tao Te Ching. Tao Te Ching, the distance between, I'm fortunate. I have lived half my life in India, half my life in the West. So at least I have those 2. I have some base, but I have no base in China whatsoever. And to actually learn that, and I work very hard. I worked very hard. I would read multiple translations. And when I came to the meetup after reading all the translations, what various people had to say would make it rise up like 5x, because it is poetry. It is very deep poetry, and different people got different aspects of it. People came, so there are some people like Kevin, like Jason, like Jang, like Amon, who really know the work and who are able to bring in. But at the same time, there are people like Evanique or Joe who do not have that, but they have other base like the Bible, and they are able to bring that to bear. Each person is able to bring their rich context to bear on the same work. And what you end up getting from it is something else. So I said, okay, let me be more ambitious and let me take on the Bible. And we chose the Gospel of John. And that has been just incredible for me because I love the West. I am an American, and that is my base. Yet I did not have the Bible. So it is actually showing me the base behind what I know and love. And it is showing it in a way which is connecting to all the ideas that I have, that I've been thinking about, to realize that this was one of the first attempts, just like with Greeks. This was an early attempt of trying to make sense of the human condition. And it is a glorious attempt. And you have to read it. You're actually communicating with the book. You're communicating with the minds of Lao Tzu. You're communicating with the minds of John and others. Then we added Bhagavad Gita. Again, in that, Gospel of John has moved to a completely new level. Once we have introduced Thomas Aquinas in, we are integrating Thomas Aquinas commentary. And he's showing me something which is actually something else, which is like another order of magnitude higher of how do you use words? How do you think? And I've concluded that I can only babble. And so I can see like a 10x improvement possible in what I am saying right now, because that's what Aquinas actually does in sentence after sentence and in lecture after lecture. And then it is Bhagavad Gita. And that in some ways is the most interesting, most challenging, because it is connecting up with my past. I have all that culture in me. At the same time, I have been away from it. So I'm discovering something new. But the level that is next after that is to see connections between these things. And at each of these, not only in the part of communing with the text and in being able to see connections between them, everybody who is here is contributing, is adding there. And it's like hearing things in stereo or in this very rich sound. You know, you're standing in the middle of the room and all these great people are talking to you, and each is putting forth their own viewpoint. You know, you disagree with many things, and that's how it should be. You know, you have your own thoughts, and those are very important, to have your own thoughts, but you are listening to the other people. The listening, I've learned to listen a little bit better than what I've been able to do before. So folks, thank you so much. This has been, this is just such an incredible experience. And thank you for the comments on the communication. And we're going to keep building on this, and I think new things are going to come out of it. It's the big thing that I'm trying to do. My next big project is to take some of the things which we are doing at the oral level and put it back into writing. And I'm trying to figure out how to do that. My first project is going to be, I'm taking the meetups that Mark Stallman has done with us on the 3 spheres and make that into a written work. So that's what I'm working on. But I look forward to doing more of that. And again, I'm open to any kind of ideas, any kind of collaboration that anybody wants to do on that, of how do you move from, we've kind of shown how you can take a book, take something that is written and put an envelope of conversation around it in order to bring out the most of it. We saw it happen live today. Okay, the discussion, I think we got a lot more. Everybody got a lot more from the book as a result of this conversation. And the next step would be to say, okay, how do we bring some of it back into writing of some kind so that that can serve as a higher base? And doing that with everything that we are doing, no matter what piece of writing we are looking at, whether it is Tao Te Ching, whether Bible or Bhagavad Gita, how do you go back and put it into writing so that it can serve as a higher base on which we can do another round of conversation? So that's what I'm looking forward to. Thank you very much, everybody. This has been amazing. Good night, everybody. Bye.